My name is Antje Monshausen. I'm head of Tourism Watch at Bread for the World, and I'm very pleased today to welcome you on our seminar on aviation, climate crisis, and governance. I'm welcoming you on behalf of the Transforming Tourism Initiative, which is a global open network of NGOs, tourism practitioners, and academia that reflects in how far tourism is contributing to the achievement of the 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development, or in which way tourism is harming the achievement of the global sustainability goals. Our core principles as the network are that human rights and self-determination of communities must be at the core of every tourism development. This includes the right to meaningful participation and consultation, including free, prior, and informed consent on whether, to what extent, and in what form tourism takes place. If tourism is developed, it should seek a widespread and fair distribution of economic and social benefits throughout the recipient communities, including improving local prosperity, quality of life, and social equity. Tourism that is not contributing to sustainable development is not a form of economic development that we would be in favor of. And last but not least, tourism should be a positive and a beneficial experience for travelers, but also for people in the destination, for the hosts, in order to act as a force for mutual understanding, empathy, and respect. With the Transforming Tourism Initiative, we already had different seminars during the COVID-19 pandemic. Our aim was to strengthen civil society perspectives in this debate on how tourism restarts in a hopefully post-COVID tourism scenario. We had different seminars so far. They are all recorded and documented, and you can find them on our homepage. I'm very happy today that we have two great speakers with us. Today we are Daniela Subtil from StayGrounded Network and Marte van der Graaf from Transport and Environment, a Brussels-based think tank. We will start with Marte, who is an expert at Transport and Environment on the decarbonization of aviation, both on the political as well as from the technical perspective. She's working on topics such as sustainable aviation fuels, fair carbon pricing, and how this translates into legislation. She also works on the global governance aspects of decarbonizing aviation, which will be central to our seminar today. Before we are starting, and I'm handing over to Marte, I just wanted to share two figures with you. One is, it's in German, but I think with the symbols you can see what this graph or what this infographic should tell. We see that aviation today is the main mode of transport in international tourism. These are figures from 2019, and they are global. So when people are leaving their country for tourism, the majority of them, 55%, use air transport for this. When we are comparing this with earlier times, we see that there's a tremendous growth in the dependence of tourism from air transport, which is not given, as we can see in past other modes of transport were also had high numbers when it comes to tourism. And when we are not looking back, but in the future, I'm sharing with you the forecast of Airbus, market forecast for 2021 to 2040, where those experts on aviation forecast a growth of 3.6% in passenger numbers per year. And when we translate it in the number of commercial aircrafts, we see that the number of small aircrafts is increasing by 76%, of medium-sized aircraft of 14%, and the large aircrafts also will grow of 10%. So we see a severe growth in tourism that is feeding, or that is eating all reductions that are gained when it comes to higher fuel efficiency, a higher efficiency of the aircraft themselves. But this is now Marte's topic, so I'm very happy to hand over to her.
Yes, hello, I'm Marte. I've worked in the aviation team at Transport and Environment since August. T&E, Transport and Environment, was established over 30 years ago, and we're now Europe's leading clean transport campaign group. We've helped shape some of Europe's most important environmental laws, especially on cars, and our rapidly growing aviation team is now working hard to bring forward policies to decarbonise the aviation industry. I've delved into the technologies and policies that we see as necessary to bring aviation in line with net zero targets that both the industry itself and world governments have committed to. And these are we have many member organisations. So the problem with aviation is that it is famously the fastest growing and most polluting mode of transport, but it's also the most difficult to decarbonise. As you can see from this graph, aviation traffic in Europe grew 67% between 2005 and 2019, and its emissions by 24%. This means that aviation now represents 4.9% of Europe's pre-COVID total emissions. And that's just the CO2 effects. The non-CO2 effects are the hidden iceberg of aviation, and they actually represent 2/3 of aviation's climate impact. They're mostly caused by contrails, so the white clouds that you see in the sky, which trap heat and cause further warming. As highlighted by last year's IPCC report, we're on track to meet or exceed 1.5 degrees of warming, which scientists warn is a level above which many of the effects of climate breakdown will become irreversible. So whilst decarbonising aviation is not easy, we don't really have an option. So I'm here to talk about how to decarbonise aviation. Travel and tourism are obviously highly important to many aspects of the global economy, but the right to travel and tourism should not come at the expense of the right to citizens to live on a safe planet. So there are 4 pillars that are crucial to decarbonising aviation. The first 2 points here are technological. So firstly, you have sustainable aviation fuels. There are 2 types. Firstly, you have biofuels. Here you have to be very careful, since some of the biofuels could actually have worse greenhouse gas emissions than fossil fuels due to deforestation and loss of biodiversity caused by burning them as fuels. Therefore, there have to be really high standards to ensure that these are used sustainably. These biofuels do already exist and are being used, albeit in small quantities, in planes today. The second type of sustainable aviation fuels are synthetic fuels, also known as e-kerosene. These are made out of green hydrogen and captured carbon from the air. This technology is, however, far less developed, and it will be at least 10 years until these fuels are more widespread. The second technological solution are hydrogen and electric planes. These technologies are also still being developed and therefore will not start to play a key role until the 2030s. Furthermore, due to the extra weight of adding hydrogen and electric technology to planes, this will only be a solution for short-haul aviation, not long-haul. Therefore, since we still have a way to go on the technology that will eventually decarbonise aviation, we must turn to other solutions. The first is fair carbon pricing. What this essentially means is that those who create the emissions have to pay for their emissions. The second is demand reduction, or demand management. As I made clear, the technological solutions to decarbonising aviation simply won't be there on a large scale until the 2030s. Therefore, for the next 10 years at least, the focus will have to be on reducing demand. And you can see how, T&E published a roadmap this year on how to decarbonise aviation. And this graph is from that roadmap. And you can see here that it's the first, until the early 2030s, demand management will have to play a role. And then after that, you can see that the technological aspects can play a much more significant role. These bottom sections here representing the technological aspects, so e-kerosene, advanced biofuels, and hydrogen and electric aircraft. It's important to remember, however, that even after biofuels, biofuels are only sustainable if they are made from waste materials, and we don't have an infinite supply of waste materials. And technologies such as e-kerosene and zero-emission planes will be energy intensive. So ultimately, flying less is the best solution for sustainable aviation, but there are technological solutions that will eventually provide some more solutions. So the other topic that I came to talk about today is how international governments can reduce the carbon footprint of aviation. In theory, the answer is yes. In practice, it hasn't proved to be so easy. The United Nations have a special body dedicated to aviation called the International Civil Aviation Organization, or ICAO, as I'll be referring to it, where global decisions on aviation are made. There have been moves within this organization to implement global decarbonization efforts for the aviation sector. This included a long-term aspirational goal, or LTAG, as it is on the slide. And this basically says that the aviation industry must reach net zero by 2050. This international governance body, so ICAO, has also introduced CORSIA, its carbon offsetting scheme. However, T&E have been very vocal about the fact that we mustn't be fooled by the supposed ambition of this international organization. Firstly, on the long-term aspirational goal, the key word here in this is aspirational. This goal is nothing more than an empty statement, and the text literally reads, as I put on the slide, that the goal does not attribute specific obligations or commitments in the form of emissions reduction goals to individual states. It's easy to make claims about reaching net zero if you don't actually have any binding measures in place to enforce them. Secondly, ICAO's offsetting scheme called CORSIA here, so Carbon Offsetting Reduction Scheme for International Aviation, will not help to decarbonize aviation, in our opinion. Firstly, airlines only pay to offset growth in emissions, crucially, which was decided in September would be any growth above 85% of 2019 emissions. So there's absolutely no ambition built into the scheme to decrease the emissions of international aviation over time. Secondly, major aviation markets like China, Russia, Brazil, and India don't participate in the scheme. Therefore, with all of that information, according to our calculations, a mere 22% of total international aviation emissions would be covered by the scheme and therefore offset in 2030. So the issue, first of all, is that a small proportion of global emissions are covered anyway, and we're not even decreasing emissions. We're not aiming to decrease emissions at all with this scheme. The second issue is that offsets are not a credible way to decarbonize aviation, in T&E's opinion. Offsetting programs do not guarantee emission reductions. Nature-based offsets that claim to protect an area of land from deforestation, for example, cannot guarantee that these forests won't be destroyed, for example, by wildfires or other natural disasters anyway. Furthermore, it's possible that offsets are used to protect a piece of land that was never at risk of being deforested in the first place. So there's no guarantee that it's additional. The other major issue is that the offsets under CORSIA scheme are incredibly cheap to buy. According to our analysis, the scheme adds just €1.70 to the price of a ticket from Europe to New York. Therefore, it's cheaper for airlines to continue polluting and buy offsets rather than actually reducing emissions by investing in sustainable aviation fuels. Furthermore, there's a huge oversupply of offsets, so the carbon price will never be high or increase, meaning there will always be enough cheap carbon credits to cover demand. Therefore, this global scheme won't really lead to a decrease in aviation emissions, in our opinion. On a European level, we have seen some more ambition on legislating the decarbonising of aviation thanks to the Green Deal proposed by the European Commission last July. This was a package of multiple different pieces of legislation that should lead to a net 55% reduction in emissions by 2030 and climate neutrality by 2050. There are 4 pieces of legislation that apply specifically to aviation. Firstly, last week, the world's, it hasn't been passed yet. Last week, almost the world's first mandate for sustainable aviation fuels was passed, but it probably will now be passed in March, which will enforce European targets beginning in 2025 and increasing until 2050 for sustainable aviation fuels. So there'll be a kind of minimum amount that airlines have to take into their planes of sustainable fuels. This will send a really important signal to the rest of the world that it's possible to set targets for sustainable aviation fuel, and will also have a good incentivizing effect on investment into and the production of these fuels, which will be crucial for decarbonising aviation. Secondly, last week the EU did pass a legislation to strengthen the EU's carbon market to price aviation emissions. Unfortunately, this carbon pricing will only apply to flights within the EU, which excludes the largest chunk of Europe's aviation emissions and long-haul flying, which is the largest problem in aviation. The other key piece of legislation would introduce a tax on fossil kerosene, which is a much needed step since it is inexcusable that airlines can continue to operate almost tax-free. However, political tensions will make this a drawn-out decision. Ultimately, the aviation and tourism industries have a big challenge ahead of them. I think both industries and governments recognise that decarbonisation needs to happen now, but the pace at which it's happening and the ambition on the table is currently far too low. We need to see significant investments in the technologies that can actually lead to decarbonisation of the aviation sector and not be distracted by empty global pledges and schemes. Yeah, thank you very much. I look forward to questions.
Thank you very much, Marte, for this great, impressive and a little bit depressing overview and for sharing your expertise with us. The audience, if you have questions, just write them in the chat or raise your hands. In the meantime, I would like to ask one question. Over the last 5, 6, 7 years since CORSIA was developed and decided. I've seen a lot of governments, also governments saying, well, this is not enough, it will not work, the whole offsetting thing, just relying on too cheap offsets. Is there any chance for a review of this CORSIA scheme? Are there any front runners, some governments who try to influence this process again, or is it given until 2050 and then a new instrument might come or might not come? So what's your opinion about it?
Yeah, that's a good question. So on governments criticising CORSIA, it's true that there is recognition that it's not a perfect scheme. The issue is, however, and what we've seen happening in European politics, is that the reason why the EU's carbon market and carbon pricing didn't extend to long-haul flights and is now only limited to intra-EU flights and therefore not covering the majority of Europe's emissions, is because governments didn't want to create a diplomatic issue regarding CORSIA and didn't want there to be any overlap. And therefore, there was a lot of conversation, at least within EU politics, around the fact that CORSIA is a good scheme and that the long-term aspirational goal is a good goal. And I think there's a lot of conversation around the fact that this scheme will do enough, and that's why in the end last week this carbon market didn't get extended. So I think that is a real issue in the sense that governments can criticize it, but then that didn't actually get taken in. It didn't really change anything in the politics, because if they genuinely thought it was a bad scheme, they would have used the EU's much stronger scheme instead. In terms of review, so the way that the legislation that for the emissions trading system, so the ETS, the carbon market, was passed last week, is that there was a strong caveat that the only way that the Parliament could accept the Council's, the EU, like politics level, the only way that they were willing to accept that it would only be intra-EU was through the fact that in the next 5 years or so, I don't know the exact date, I think until 2026, the European Commission will have to do a review of CORSIA to basically see if it's a strong enough scheme. So that's now in the new legislation that there will have to be a review. And I think from T&E at least, we'll be doing a lot of work over the next few years to show that it's a terrible scheme. And that the ETS, so like the Europe system, needs to be applied further instead of this scheme.
Yeah, you already had a strong focus on the issue that the majority of flights are taking place in Europe. So the legislation that comes in place in Europe will contribute a bit, but the large growth markets when it comes to aviation are not included in it. And this is to hand over to Daniela Subtil, who is with us today from the StayGrounded network that is also looking at the issue of climate justice as well, looking at those who are affected by climate change and which contribution aviation and air transport plays in it. Daniela is the network coordinator of StayGrounded and focused particularly on the network in Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as Southeast Asia. Where she supports members to resist aviation-related projects like airport expansion, but also in the context of offset projects, agrofuel plantations, and refineries, as well as related mass tourism projects. Daniela has a background in international development and sustainable resource management, and she's active in the climate justice movement. Daniela, I'm very happy that you are with us today and bring us to our attention a little bit more the international dimension on it, and which people are flying, which people are not flying, and which solutions might help, and which countersides those potential solutions have. Thank you, Daniela, for sharing your insights with us.
Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, good evening, depending where you're joining. So I think, first of all, I would like to salute the Transforming Tourism Initiative for organizing this seminar series to highlight the role of aviation in international tourism. I think it's about time to continue to analyze this, and for that, also thank you for inviting us, StayGrounded, to bring in this climate justice perspective. I'm speaking on behalf of this StayGrounded network, which is an international network working for the reduction of air traffic and also working for a just mobility system for all. I will not dip into the history of StayGrounded, but I think it's also good to mention that it's not really old. It was initiated in 2016 by climate justice grassroots groups leading local struggles against airport expansion in Europe, but also elsewhere in the world, for instance, in Mexico. And they had this global perspective of justice and had a strong focus on the climate crisis. And I think StayGrounded's mission is to address the root causes of the climate, ecological, and global justice crisis, and focusing on this particularly grave example of climate injustice, which is aviation. And actually, so before dive deep into the injustice analysis, I thought it was worth mentioning or understanding the contribution to the climate of aviation to the climate crisis and global heating. But I think Marte already covered it quite well. But I think it's even good to mention again, like these known CO2 impacts. And why is this important? Because if we would cut drastically aviation today, so the demand, we could have immediate gains or in reduction of emissions. So this is actually very good to just reinforce what Marta was saying, and also to point out that if aviation is projected to grow, as also Antje was mentioning in the beginning, this will be a total disaster in terms of what aviation could eat up from the remaining global budget for the 1.5 degrees. But since Marta already touched upon this question, I think I would just move forward to understand who is flying. So who is causing this crisis, or the contribution to this climate crisis from the aviation sector, who is enjoying the perks of this form of mobility. And when we look at it, we find a very unfair picture. So we have 1% of global's population, and to put it in perspective, we are talking about 8 million people, which is roughly Germany's total inhabitants, which are the frequent flyers, and they are responsible for half of total commercial aviation emissions globally. So we have a wealthy minority with a huge responsibility in air traffic's contribution to the climate crisis, while roughly 80% of the world's population have never flown. And this is not only problematic because we have around 6.4 billion people that have never traveled by plane, and we're talking like about round numbers, but this is very problematic because these are generally the people that are most vulnerable to the consequences of the climate crisis and the one already impacted by the climate crisis. And we can witness that today. So we're talking about the poorest people in the world, most exposed to this kind of impacts. And also included in these, we're not talking about like the poorest in the global south, probably that never actually set foot on an airplane, but we're also talking about the people that are the ones that have been sacrificed by living in areas near airports, hindering the insane noise and air pollution levels from air traffic. And this applies to either Europe, United States. We're talking sometimes about suburban areas where airports are located, and when we can find the lower social classes. So after all, we paying the price of this damaging activity are not the people that are benefiting from it. And I think this is a very important aspect of aviation. It's also important to understand that probably the ones that are dependent on activities that are dependent on aviation will also be the ones affected by the climate crisis, but at the same time impacted by the drastic reductions that have to happen in international aviation. And I think it's an important aspect. And continue to talk about justice or injustice. I will talk about the social and political perspective of these false climate solutions, and Marte already touched upon some. And I think we'll just have complementary presentations. I think this is good. What is important to understand here, and again to recall what Antje was saying at the beginning about the growth of aviation. So what is happening is that in order to justify the business as usual and these growth plans under the current climate and ecological crisis, the sector has come up with several false solutions that, more than delaying serious action, also again put the burden of solving this crisis on those that are not contributing to those crises. And I think this is also very important to mention. Marte already talked about briefly about the offsets, how they are ineffective from a if we want a technical perspective. So they are not effective to reduce emissions. And then they often lead to ecological and human rights issues. So we're talking about local conflicts and or situations of land grabbing, and also indigenous groups have been calling these kind of schemes, offset schemes, as a form of carbon colonialism, as they restrict indigenous and peasant communities to continue to use forests. In the case of, for instance, REDD+ kind of projects, to use these forests in their ancestral way. So in order to not disturb the storage of carbon. And of course, also, as Marte was saying, offsets divert from real solutions. They are really just distracting us from getting to what we need to do to address the problem of aviation. Another problematic solution is agrofuels, and so they are important. They can probably play a marginal role in decarbonizing aviation, but only if we tackle the problem of demand and the growth plans. And what is important to focus here, and again from this injustice perspective, is that that even though that the promises of scale up this agrofuel have not been materialized, promoting the idea of sustaining current air traffic levels or even future air traffic levels with agrofuels is dangerous, because the use of this type of kerosene will certainly increase the competition for land. So land that could be used to produce food. And we're talking about a world that is where Arab land is becoming scarcer and scarcer. And this is certainly an aspect to take into account. And also that this fake solution can lead to environmental and social impacts, such as biodiversity loss, rising food prices and water scarcity. And we launched this year our case study on agrofuel refinery in Paraguay. The title is Producing Fuel for Other People's Planes. And this is about the first refinery for aviation agrofuels in Paraguay, the biggest in South America. And again, highlights the injustice because we're talking about a country where people fly the least in all South America. And we are already witnessing how these are the communities that are not flying, but are affected in their livelihoods by this refinery, but also the sources, the supplies that have to go into that refinery. And even if it's about second generation, so biofuel production, talking about using animal fat and other waste materials, but this has been also increasing the speculation to use invasive species as pongamia, but also increasing the pressure to deforest more and more in pressure regions where there are pristine forests in the Chaco region in Paraguay. I think at last we can also talk about this delusional promise that the technological solutions like gains in efficiency, electric aircrafts, hydrogen and e-fuels will decarbonize aviation and keep the current growth path. And we used to say that this is too little, too late, because it's not available at, like most of them are not available at scale yet. It will take some time until they are available. And again, they just distract us from what we have to do now, that is degrow aviation. And this is the only way to decarbonize aviation. With what we have at the moment is to really reduce demand. And this is also unjust because the more we wait to tackle aviation, the more communities will be exposed to the effects of the climate breakdown. And it's, again, the ones that are potentially not flying. And I think this makes the case for a just transition. So especially after COVID-19 and also in this forum where so many people are talking about tourism, that has been certainly felt that we need a just transition. We need to talk about resilient communities and economies. And I think it's good to understand where we are at in the climate crisis. And we should know that aviation, due to its dependency on fossil fuels, is on a collision course. And either we come up with a plan to change aviation, or aviation will, by disaster, change our societies, the lives of workers and communities that are directly and indirectly dependent on it. And this will take us by surprise. And we should prevent this disaster from happening by downscaling the industry in line with the 1.5 degrees trajectory. And we can do that through progressive taxation. Marta was already talking about the importance of taxing kerosene, so jet fuel. That is something that is not still in place in 2022. But we can also think about more like progressive forms of taxation, taxing frequent flyers, even promoting like an international air passenger adaptation levy, when we can thinking of also that the funds that are generated through this taxation could feed a fund like for loss and damage and help actually the communities that are going to be exposed the most to these changes. And I think this is important, of course, to take these steps to protect aviation workers, but also others that are from dependent sectors. And we include, of course, tourism. And I think this is fundamental here. We're talking about also many groups, especially in the Global South, that have started to ask themselves what would happen to region highly dependent on international tourism if air traffic was cut drastically, but also in some cities in Europe, that is what we know and are most familiar with, that are also taking these steps, at least at the civil society level. And we know that we need to create a just mobility system by reimagining the way we travel, work, produce, trade, and spend our leisure time, following a logic of localizing our economy rooted in justice and fairness. And in our recent publication, Common Destination, Reframing Aviation to Ensure a Safe Landing and Lay the Tracks Towards a Fair Planet, is actually an attempt to coming up with alternative narratives to the mainstream messages promoted by the aviation sector and the tourism industry of moving more, faster, and further away. So I think this is very important also to reject this and rethink how we can reject this and build as an alternative. And we would like to invite you to have a look at this guide. I will afterwards post some links in the chat as well. And to come to an end, and also foremost of invitation, and to highlight that StayGrounded is a worldwide movement. And I think it's important to bring this to the spotlight, that to cover these many dimensions encompassed in our struggle to counter aviation. We count with an international network of more than 200 member initiatives, such as local airport opposition and climate justice groups, NGOs, trade unions, indigenous movements, initiatives fostering alternatives to aviation, organizations supporting communities, struggling against offset projects, but also agrofuel plantation or refineries, and also groups opposing mass tourism. And with such diverse network, we have also to take into account different contexts and backgrounds, understanding that a struggle against airport expansion in Mexico and in France are different in their strategies, topics, and even repression levels. Also that groups tackling over-tourism in Europe deal with different challenges than groups addressing mass tourism in Dominican Republic and in the Maldives. And that the alternative to aviation available will be different in different regions and continents. And just to put it here, this map is actually not completely updated with the new numbers of these more than 200 members, but we wanted to also invite you and say that we're always open to welcome new members who would like to join our collective efforts to rethink these fundamental issues, to reframe aviation and also tourism. And also, I finish by inviting you to go to our website at stay-grounded.org, and please reach out if you have further questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daniela, for this fast walk through the solutions, the potential good and bad solutions around aviation, and also showing us your lively network and how you are connecting those initiatives on the local ground. Daniela, maybe you could share a little bit your thoughts about local resistance, local dialogues, because when we are looking at aviation in general, we see that there's a global governance scheme around it. When we are looking at taxation, it's a national issue. But finally, tourism is taking place where people are living in their communities, in their municipalities. So what is your experiences in getting local stakeholders, political decision makers on board on such discussions? Do you have good experience with this, or is it a hard fight to get those topics on the agenda?
I think I would talk about an example in Lisbon. I think this is a good example regarding also airport expansion and how it's related to this boom of the tourism industry in the capital of Portugal. And I think so the best way of controlling that municipalities can control like air traffic and also tourism is to cut or the capacities to accommodate more flights and more air traffic. And the way, for instance, that has been heated discussion in the last years in Lisbon because they wanted to build a new airport with more capacity for more passengers. And actually, they wanted to build it in the outskirts of the city of Lisbon, so actually encompassing other municipalities. And these municipalities used a legal framework to actually reject the project of airport in their jurisdiction. Let's say that way. And actually, the new airport is being reviewed and where it could be now being built. Of course, like our Portuguese members of StayGrounded are very happy with this decision and support this, because this is, if we control air traffic levels, we will also control like mass tourism. And of course, there's also other measures that municipalities can take and also regulate housing and the housing that is available for tourism. But this is a longer and a more difficult fight, also because of this urgency of and the pressure of what tourism represents in the GDP, for instance. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, that brings us to one of the questions from the chat. The statistics about which part of global air travel is attributed to tourism. So having this argument of tourism being a very, very attractive economic sector, it lost a little bit its shiny masquerade in the last years, but anyway, it's still one argument that is coming, how dependent destinations are from tourism and therefore from aviation as well. So the question is if there are any statistics on which part of global air travel is attributed to tourism. Including the question if there's a source. I had some preparation, some research on statistics, and it's difficult to find those statistics. I found just recently that the German Association of airlines, they are like saying how dependent tourism is from aviation, and that aviation is the backbone. That was literally what they were saying. Aviation is the backbone of the tourism industry. But as far as I can say from my part of research of 2 hours today, I didn't find any reliable number that would say this part of aviation goes to tourism or is attributed to travel and tourism. Daniela or Marte, do you have different statistics or numbers?
No, I don't either.
Yeah, so no, I was doing the same research last week, and because we have been trying to tackle more the topic of tourism also in StayGrounded, and it's a very difficult number to get. Yeah. Sorry about that.
Yeah, I think just one thing that came to my mind when I was doing this research is that there's no doubt that the aviation dependence from tourism is growing. So the number of travelers who are using planes and their proportion in comparison to all travelers is growing, which is a very, very bad development in this regard. Carla, would you like to ask your question directly, or do you want me to read it from the chat?
So what I wanted to ask to Marta and Daniela was if they know And if they know this new measure, how do they value the initiative that France has took for forbidding short distance domestic flights that could be done by train in less than 2 hours and 30 minutes? Because, for example, they are saying to apply this measure also in other countries, such as in Spain, for example, or any. I don't know if you are familiar with this new. It's something very, very new, but I think that you will have comments on that. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't mind going first. So obviously it's a huge first step. It's really significant and will encourage a lot. I really hope that does encourage a lot of other countries to take similar steps. The thing is that a lot of things need to happen before these things become more widely accepted. So I don't know how closely you followed the developments last week, but only the European Commission basically went back to the French government and said that only 3 routes could have this, were able to have this restriction because there aren't good enough train routes and train infrastructure in place to be able to replace the flights. And that meant that we did calculations, and that means that this short haul ban will cover 0.3% of emissions departing from France. So it's a very, very, very small number, and it's great. It's low-hanging fruit. It's what we need to tackle first, and it's super important. But I think we also need to. So first, there are 2 things. So first of all, better investment needs to happen in train infrastructure so that these flights can be replaced and that's politically acceptable to do. And secondly, I think it's really important that even though getting rid of short haul flights is important, that doesn't distract us from the fact that long haul aviation is the thing that we really need to be tackling, and that because governments are covering this, that we don't say like, oh great, you're covering it, and then that's it. So yeah, not to let them like be that the only thing that they do. I don't know if Daniela has any other comments.
No, it was basically it. I think it's something to celebrate, as you said. It sets a precedent, and I think this is very significant. But it's at the same time, it doesn't cover a lot of roads, and I think it's important to continue. If the bans it's a great solution or a great way to move forward, but I think it's important to continue to increase at least like the distances and the duration of the flights, because otherwise we will continue with these marginal numbers and not having these like significant reductions in emissions. And I think in the case of Europe, apart from investing in trains, I mean, we have good infrastructure that is there. We could just reinvest and give back the importance of railways in Europe, but also the importance of night trains. And I think they are very significant in Europe. And I think this is relevant for Europeans that are listening to us. But also a very good solution for longer trips within the European space.
And sometimes one point that comes to my mind is also this, that this is contributing also to a cultural change. So young people who are relearning to use public transportation, to use trains. I have families living here in Berlin who don't have a car, but who are flying and who rarely use a train at all. So having this experience back, bringing it to the families, makes a mobility transformation, makes it possible. So maybe you could elaborate also a little bit on this cultural change, what is necessary to introduce it. I don't want to get away from the legislative thing, not at all, but I think if we want to have a transformation in mobility, it's also cultural dimensions, learning of other practices of mobility again. So Marta, Daniela, what is your say about it?
Yeah, so within Transport and Environment, we're currently running a campaign called the Travel Smart campaign. And what this basically focuses on is encouraging better business travel habits. So basically, from our perspective, we kind of took the opportunity of COVID and everyone having to do everything online. And saying, okay, you managed then, so how can you change that now? And a big part of that is also shifting mentalities on rail. So they're working a lot to make to make rail feel more exciting and to share stories about rail, and that you can have a really good work day working from the train, and the different opportunities that you have rather than just flying and then flying back in a day or 2 days and how exhausting that is. So it's really like that campaign is all about like changing the narrative about how we travel related to corporate travel, which is really important part of our work.
Yeah. So also absolutely, and also in StayGrounded we have also these slogans of travel if there is a tomorrow, and we also have been working on developing narratives of traveling differently, like grounded travels, and also with travel policies for organizations are developing a network of consultants where organizations and institutions can reach out to get advice about the way they travel. But also I think another point that I mentioned also in my input is like really rethink and reshape the way we move and why we move and the amount of times that we move. And I think this is also important, and how fast we go. And we have to also to understand that this hyper-mobile society that we live in, it's part of an economic system, like structure that really wants to move everything faster and to generate more money and more money. And I think this it's important to think about the cultural shift, because this comes through education, but the cultural shift will be, of course, enforced by what politics and legislation can shape that change. And it's important to have in mind that we cannot just move all the travel that we have by plane to grounded travel. It's important to understand which are the traveling that we really need to do, and how often. And I think these are also very important questions to have in mind.
Yeah, thank you, Daniela. That was a very nice word at the end of our seminar. I wanted to thank you again, Daniela and Marte, for your insights and sharing your expertise with us. Now it's up to all of us to get active. So I would like to invite everyone here in this room to follow the important work of our speakers. You can also sign the Transforming Tourism Declaration if you are sending me an email. You can share the documentation of this seminar, which will be finalized in January, including Spanish subtitles. So share it in social media. And please participate tomorrow in our webinar on airports and the local effects on airports. Daniela already mentioned it a bit, how airport development is affecting people. We will talk with Rose Bridger about dynamics and trends when it comes to evictions in the context of airport development and airport extensions. And we will hear from cases from Tanzania as well as from India on how aviation and the infrastructure around aviation, which are airports, basically, how this is affecting the local situation. I'm thanking our speakers, and I'm also thanking Carla and Becky for the translation of this seminar. Thank you very much for allowing our Spanish-speaking participants to follow this debate. And as I said, we will present the video, including subtitles, very soon in January. And I'm hoping to see some of you, or most of you, all of you, tomorrow again for our second seminar on the local effects of aviation. Thank you very much and have a nice afternoon.